systemic risks. Now what that means is that if these risks materialize, they don't only create particular negative consequences, but they actually trigger additional risks that cascade through social systems, and that not only cascade within one system, but that spill over into other social systems. To give an example, COVID-19, which is of course a zoonotic disease that has materialized, the risks related to COVID-19 aren't just that an individual catches COVID-19 and gets sick, but also that the health system itself comes under pressure. And if the health system as a whole comes under pressure, that means that people who don't have COVID-19 but who struggle with other illnesses are also at risk. And if you have an entire society with an impaired health, that also creates a number of financial and economic risks, so they spill over into other systems. Now, what my research argues is that if you have that kind of profile, then the advantages of cutting off the risks at the pass, of intervening early, far outstrip the advantages of waiting and of trying to deal with all these different spillovers further down the line. And then there's also a second point, and that has to do with uncertainty. Now, traditionally, the presence of uncertainty surrounding a particular problem is used as an argument to postpone intervention. The idea being that, well, if we're not sure what the relationship is between a risk and particular impacts, then we might be making a mistake. We might be making the wrong kind of intervention, so we should hold off. That is the case, but here my work argues that you have to look at the kind of uncertainty that is prominent in the context of climate change and in the context of zoonotic diseases. If you think about that, here we really don't have that much of cause-effect uncertainty anymore. The relationship between rising man-made greenhouse gas emissions and rising temperatures and the health and environmental impacts from that relationship is soundly established. And similarly, for zoonotic diseases, we know what the main drivers are of zoonotic diseases. They are habitat encroachments for wildlife and intensive farming practices for animal farming and cattle rearing. So that is not the kind of uncertainty we are contending with mostly. Overwhelmingly, nowadays, our uncertainty on issues of climate change and zoonotic disease have to do with distribution. Which dam is going to burst at what point, which particular impact is going to occur at what moment, which particular disease is going to mutate and is going to transfer over to a human population. But that kind of uncertainty, distribution uncertainty, that uncertainty is not one that is best fought with end-of-the-line late intervention measures. It's best fought with early intervention measures. So those are two key reasons why my work argues that we should be investing more in early stage interventions in both of these fields. Now, practically, what does this translate in? Well, for zoonotic diseases, for example, it would mean that we would invest a lot in having much more extensive habitats protection, and also really in thoroughly changing the production processes in the global supply chain for animal products. When it comes to climate change, it means investing a lot more in having tougher restrictions on issues of development consent at the planning stage, and also in downscaling and phasing out the very production of fossil fuels to begin with. Now, politically, these are hard messages to sell, but what I hope my research and more of our research here at LSE shows is that, at least from a risk regulation perspective, they're the sensible choice to make.
Hello, my name is Emily Burdine, and I work at the London School of Economics Grantham Research Institute on climate change and the environment, on the Climate Change Laws of the World project. A large part of the work I do involves helping to maintain our online database that tracks legislation, policies, and legal cases around the world that involve climate change, alongside our partners at Columbia University's Sabin Center for Climate Change Law. The database is open to the public, and I would encourage all participants attending the summit to explore the online version of the database at some point if they haven't done so already. For the rest of this video clip, I will be talking about legal responses to transboundary climate risks in food security. To begin with, one way in which countries have already begun responding to some of the transboundary climate risks to global food supply chains and food security has been to create provisions in their national climate strategies and policies that introduce proposals for ways countries can adapt and become more resilient to the negative impacts of climate change. There are at least 114 such examples on the Climate Change Laws of the World database, and many of these measures focus on changing agricultural and land use practices to adapt to extreme weather events such as droughts. However, while many of these policies propose measures that implicitly address transboundary climate risks related to extreme weather events such as drought, very few address non-weather related risks to food security and agriculture, such as those created by supply chain disruptions, export restrictions, and other events that cause price shocks. Related to this is the fact that no country can single-handedly address and eliminate transboundary climate risks, given our interconnected and globalized food systems and climate change's global impact. So unfortunately, while national adaptation policies may be more easily produced than their regional or international counterparts, there are limits to what national policies can achieve alone. In the international sphere, while there is awareness of transboundary climate risks to food security, policy measures are currently lacking. It is possible that we could see the creation of regional partnerships or a broader international agreement specifically addressing the transboundary climate risks posed to food systems. But these types of responses are quite complex, take time to develop, and generally speaking, can be difficult to enforce. In the interim, litigation is another tool with which to compel climate action by both state and non-state actors. Litigation has already played an important role in challenging inadequate law and policy responses to climate change. This year, in its summary for policymakers, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change recognized that litigation can affect the ambition and outcome of climate governance. We are seeing increasingly diverse types of legal cases being brought against a broad variety of public and private actors. Since 2015, we have seen many cases brought on human rights and constitutional rights grounds, with applicants arguing that inaction on climate change violates government duties to protect and uphold human rights, or rights protected by constitutions and international agreements. We are also starting to see more cases that target international supply chains, in recognition of the global impact that climate harms may have in our globalized world. Two cases stand out as particularly relevant to this discussion of transboundary climate risks and food security. The first is a case that has been filed before the European Court of Human Rights that uses novel arguments that focus on the danger of agricultural methane emissions and highlight that soy feed consumption in UK factory farming is a key driver of deforestation in the Amazon basin. This case, Humane Being versus the United Kingdom, connects the impact of factory farming practices on deforestation, human health, and climate change to government inaction on risk mitigation. The second case was filed in Germany by Sol Luciano Luluya, a Peruvian farmer who lives in Juarez, Peru, against RWE, Germany's largest electricity producer. Luciano Luluya's suit alleges that RWE, having knowingly contributed to climate change by emitting substantial volumes of greenhouse gases, bears a measure of responsibility for the melting of mountain glaciers near his town of Juarez. The melting of these glaciers has given rise to an acute threat. A glacial lake located above Juarez has experienced a substantial volumetric increase and creates an increased flood risk to Luciano Luluya's town and home. Acknowledging that RWE was only a contributor to the emissions responsible for climate change and for the lake's growth, Luciano Luluya asked the court to order RWE to reimburse him for a portion of the costs that he and the Juarez authorities are expected to incur to establish flood protections. The case is now in the process of going to trial. In the summer of 2022, judges and experts from the Higher Regional Court of Ham conducted a site visit in Juarez to collect evidence and determine whether Luciano Luluya's house is threatened by a flood wave from the glacial lake. Both of these cases represent examples of cases that recognize how actions occurring in one area of the world may negatively impact and create climate harms in another, and implicitly that meeting Paris Agreement targets to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees requires concerted global efforts. Coming back to food systems, the right to food has already been codified in international treaties and at the domestic level in some jurisdictions, along with rights to a clean and livable environment. It is very likely that the volume of litigation related to food systems will grow in the future, and it is entirely plausible that we could see cases being brought in relation to the impact of climate change and transboundary risks on the right to food, and governments' duties to uphold and protect these rights. Altogether, domestic laws, international and regional agreements, and litigation have roles to play in compelling governments, as well as non-state actors, to help populations adapt to the transboundary impacts of climate change on food systems. Thank you very much for your time.